back at Atlas Software, which was the company that Google acquired to kind of start the Boulder office. And he wandered into our office one day, and somebody, I believe it was John Bacchus, for anybody who was there those days, pointed to him and said, "Do you know who that guy is?" And they said, "No." And he said, "Well, he's the guy that worked on the Death Star for Star Wars." And that was kind of like geek royalty. I was super impressed. Actually, a little bit, what would it be, like shell-shocked, I guess, or starstruck. And over the years, I've run into Colin occasionally in Boulder, and I ran into him recently here at Starbucks, where he tends to hang out with his friend here, Sierra, and asked him if he would generously come in and talk to us about his history of model making from Star Wars to 2001, and his most recent book, CoreFires, that he just finished. So without further ado, please welcome Colin Cantwell and his assistant Sierra here.
I just wanted to say one thing, that the most difficult part of this whole presentation was narrowing it down to few enough stories to fit into a 45-minute presentation. And every one of these slides that you're going to see has a lengthy story behind it, all of which are extraordinarily interesting. So,
and she's going to keep me from going too long on any one story. I'm going to add one thing that wasn't on the agenda, and that was because when I first started on leaving UCLA, and I kind of tricked him into having animation as a major, and I managed to sneak out before they caught on to bed. Commercials. The thing that I should add is not on the docket here. I decided at an early time that Frank Lloyd Wright, I really appreciated his architecture, and I quickly went to Taliesin and Taliesin West, but when nobody was there and I could look through the student drawings and so forth, and I visited all of his architectural sites that I could. And that convinced me that I should do something about what I saw in him and his work and how extraordinary it was. And what I decided to do was stick a drafting table in the back of my VW bus, and I gave myself 5 problems that I couldn't see before I got to them. And I cruised in the Pacific Northwest and decided that there was some cue to a place that I couldn't see, and I was going to design a work residence structure, architectural, to take to Frank Lloyd Wright. He was well on in his years, and that the problem would be I would have my drafting on tissue paper, however many I needed for each of these 5, and I figured I ought to be able, if I really understood what he was doing, I ought to be able to wander across the country and knock on his door. And that turned out to be true. So when somebody came back and answered, I said, I would like to show my work to Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'll wait until you come back to the door. He did. And said, Mr. Wright can't see you right now. Come in, mix with the fellowship and the people, and when he can, he will get back to you. So I had a few days seeing what was on the boards, which was the Guggenheim and some other civic projects. And Frank Lloyd Wright was interacting with the students. The reason I thought to tell you this is there's a lot of obvious awareness in this room. You're all thinking, you're all at a wild guess, not ordinary. And the extraordinary is going to be so many different unpredictable kinds, and the blending of those kinds coming together and doing what you will be doing, and the ones that you don't know whether you're doing yet or are going to do you, and how they're going to cross and mesh, and how something very unpredictable, and in fact that it's just happening and growing as you're doing it or becoming it. And that's the kind of thing that was so obvious at Taliesin. Frank Lloyd Wright's body was very frail, and his mind was so active and so expressive. And when he was interacting with the students, it was like he would pick one out, or two, or three, and throw ideas at them like darts. And he was trying to bait them into catching that dart and tossing it back, or tossing it to somebody else. And that's what I saw here. And I had a few projects that were in the building, and Frank Lloyd Wright did get to me after a few days, and I unrolled my pencil on tissue paper, and by the time he got to the fifth drawing, he asked me a lot of questions about that. And he said, you're going to join the fellowship, go back to LA. This drawing is something that you can live and expand, and come back and you'll join the fellowship and work with us as soon as you're back. And then before I was back, he died. I was so glad that I had done what I did, had his reactions to it, and what he pointed out in what I had done, communicating to him and back. And I would never have known that if I hadn't tried. I didn't find another architect I wanted to work with, and became mostly involved with computers, visuals, some architecture, and advancing visuals and motion pictures, and usually pushing the areas that hadn't been solved yet. And that was my joy and my fun. It's something that working some in this building was well appropriate to all of you.
Colin, do you want to tell us about 2001 Space Odyssey?
Yeah. 2001 was a huge jump in motion picture, and had been in work for the first half of the film, getting to where Frank Lloyd Wright Kubrick, yes, had a visit with those who were financing the film, and they went to a meeting to find out about the ending of the film, and he said, now we have to talk about the funding. We're going to start. So they did. The film was very ambitious, and nothing like it had been made. Had any of you ever seen the 2001 Space Odyssey?
What part were you responsible for?
I was responsible, strangely, for the music to that, because at a midnight conference with Stanley, he came over to his off-site digs, and he and I, on most midnights, were discussing parts of the current problems and the current goals, and that was the case here. The problem was deadly, because the film was now to such a high level that without the music, there were 4 different composers, and Kubrick realized at the end that none of them was going to work. So in that one midnight discussion, that's what we did. I suggested that the opening of the film and things that are allied with that be changed entirely, and start off with 1 minute of music from a very good composer, and that theme of that minute would then be reprised at the end of the film, and those 2 would breach the content of the film. The other 2 composers would be used during the space sections of the film and the far out sections, and they both were very appropriate, and the film itself and the acting and the script did well on matching the level. It was a film that had never been made before, and actually hasn't been made since in many ways. And Kubrick took the film home played it for 2 days, came back, and that was indeed the music to 2001. And that's the way it came to the public.
1969, first landing on the moon.
Yeah. First landing on the moon I was transformed to a HAL 9000 computer. For a few months before that, I had studied the mission, and the mission was studying itself, and the 3 astronauts on this, the first successful mission, were going to go to the moon, and all of that was at the absolute cutting edge of the challenge of the job. Part of the reason that I said I was the HAL 9000 computer was I separated all of the craziest aspects and most challenging aspects of the mission as my HAL 9000 computer, because I could contribute during times when different parts of the mission needed explaining, and that then kept it separate from the true science of the mission that was happening. It could explain what was going on.
Well, you were sitting behind Walter Cronkite during the TV broadcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like the first row. The mission, it had to make it first, all blast off from Earth, had to make it to looping around the moon at the right phase, and then on the far side of the moon, they changed the ship and had the crew of the ship that was going to orbit and take people back down to Earth. And then the other 2 guys, the first 2, got into their vessel and completed that down to the far side of the moon, and with all of the hazard of that and getting back. So, as the HAL 9000 computer, I explained some of the touchy parts of that, and I was in contact with Cronkite, and I told him, getting from here and going to land here. When they were here, I told them that the mission isn't going the way it's all the data says it's going. And the Cronkite said, you're going back on the HAL 9000, and you're going to take all of that part of the mission and track it as what you think the mission's going to be. And you studied it, you know it, but nobody can guarantee that you're going to get them to the landing that is better than the place that they would have crashed. So that's what we did. And those of you who replay the Cronkite's playing of the mission, the HAL 9000 was taking the risky track that this change, which would have to expend almost all the fuel to prolonging the orbit in that second half, and that would have to have enough fuel left to land softly in unknown terrain because the original terrain was so bad that they wouldn't survive. It was a very, very moving thing, but and it was crazy. But the other two networks, when they got to the appropriate landing place, they said that they had landed, but the guys in the capsule were still approaching the low point of the orbit and still had to get the last of the descent and all of the vertical descent down to that new terrain that had no scouring. And if you listen again now to that recording, you'll find that as their descent is going into the last of their fuel, mission control from the ground says 30 seconds, and they're talking to each other, doing the other things of the landing, 15 seconds, and that 15 seconds was how much fuel they had left to finish their descent, land on a spidery little gear, and be able to not only complete the mission, step down the ladder and do the things that they were supposed to do, go to sleep when they were supposed to do, and so on. Communicate with the guy who was still going around the moon, and then launch the top half of their landing vehicle to get far enough around to the other side of the moon to get contact, the last of the fuel in that. And after they had rested that orbit, descend successfully back to Earth. It was so moving and so insane, and it was so insane. It was this HAL 9000 that turned out to be the truth of what they were living.
What I would like to do right now is actually take over for a minute here, which Colin wasn't aware of, and go through a few more of the projects that he's done, because every project he's done has a story behind it, like I said before. So if you have any questions about this, go ahead and you can ask them after this presentation's over with. But Colin worked was the first person to work with the OmniMax at the Reuben H. Fleet Space Theater Planetarium out in San Diego, California. He designed it and designed the very first OmniMax, which is now looking like the IMAX theaters today. He worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and there's a whole story about that that's really interesting and extraordinary, which we won't have time for today. Buck Rogers, Colin, with the Buck Rogers movie, he suggested moving from the special effects department, where they actually took the whole thing apart at the end of each movie and shut it down. And his idea was to create a special effects department that was working for all the model building departments that worked for all of the different movies, so they would work one movie after the other and be more efficient. And that was his idea there. Interactive motion control system, he designed that. And what that is basically is looking at a way of keeping track. Go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead.
I can tell you one.
Yeah, it's what goes frame by frame to move anything that moves, anything that changes in the production of film, and then is being filmed during that process. For one movie, for instance, we had to have the film for war games, their giant NORAD, was being shot with all of the stuff that was on the screens in NORAD. I was giving to an animation camera system the night before for what was going to be shot the next day for all of the projectors in the most expensive scene that they had done, turning the studio into the equivalent of the NORAD progress of the whole mission. Go back to where we should be.
Okay, so we're still on track here. This is all good. Okay, so the next one was he worked with Hewlett Packard, and he actually designed the very first color monitor for Hewlett Packard, which of course later on was changed into different technologies, but that was his first one of his ideas. It was the first one of that type. And then at this point, he met George Lucas. Well, Colin, go ahead, and I'm sure everybody is, we should probably leave about now. I'm sure you don't want to hear about George Lucas.
Okay. I had experimented with new ways to do what I thought the first Star Wars movie should be. Those two, this size and this size, I just took model kits and made hundreds of tiny parts and glued them on it with instant glue and worked that way. The idea was to create all of the spaceships for the first Star Wars, all the types, and all these are the first sketches. After George had seen the models, I said, now we have to figure the budget for the film and how to photograph this. And George said, no problem. I'm going to change it to another studio, and you're going to start on what the scenes should be, and you'll talk to me after a while, and we'll work it out, and that's the way it's going to proceed. So the first one I did, I wanted the ships to be very unusual, and the story to be extremely tightly knit, so that at the opening titles, when the roll-up, they you know how the films used to have a little roll-up to get you to stop wiggling in your seat. The roll-up in this case, I made an infinite roll-up that was going into the distance and was doing the job verbally of setting up the story. And then beyond that was the further scenes that started the action. The developing of the action and its participants was going to continue through the first 15, 20 minutes of the film without any break other than the sequence of this animation that was using techniques that had not been done before. And that was going to be where it cut over to the heroine being kidnapped and all of that stuff. Everybody's being threatened by the bad guys, the good guys, and so on. The ships to do that are what I had to then design with George Lucas, and I did that by not starting his designs until I had finished them all the way through that first sequence, so that all the ships that were going to be involved in the film, I had put together the prototype models and the sequence of the story. And that was, if it was go, that would establish for the rest of the film. And my idea was, if this technique proved workable, that it was going to then spark a whole series of Star Wars movies that could carry it into further developments technically and further stories in the future.
You should talk about the X-Men and how you designed that. How did you come up with the idea?
Well, the idea, it had to be a ship that was so new and so different that you had to stay with it. And from the big ships to the littlest ships, the same thing had to be true. They had to all function in new kinds of battle, and the X-Wing was designed so that it could do the scenes that would be required. They first wanted to roll around the airport of the Spanish Air Force and decided that didn't fit the budget. The next stage of a combat was that once they took off, the wings pivoted, and that would be when it was like a cowboy drawing his guns for standoffs and so on. And the wings later would open into a full X, or for maneuverability, take this form. And that way, all forms of the battles with it would be in this very visual kind of dynamic combat.
How about the Imperial Cruiser?
The Imperial Cruiser had to be won in a game of chance. And that was the storyline. And that was going to be put together by a rogue kind of guy, very impulsive, and his sidekick, Chewbacca. Oh, yeah, right.
Get back on track here.
Back on track.
Yeah.
What's it, my back on track?
Imperial prisoners will be bigger than bird.
Yes, right. That was true, how I was directed to it was going to be bigger than Burbank. And that was the threat that throughout the early parts of the film was the evil forces coming and being extraordinarily armed.
And then we're looking at the Millennium Falcon and how that got started.
That was the one that was supposed to be won in the card game.
Yeah.
And that was with Chewbacca as the co-pilot.
What was the original shape of that you designed?
Oh yeah, that's right. The lizard stance was the way the gear and the gesture of the ship was, and that was going along fine. But then another movie came out with a sort of lizard-like spaceship. So suddenly, take two. And then out of the parts of the now obsolete ship had to all work together, and that's the way that problem was solved.
Right. Then we have the TIE Fighter.
Yes. TIE Fighter had to be so alien and evil. It had to perform as a fighter in the World War II sense, but would have to fly in unusual fashion, and it was definitely so evil that you couldn't see how it took off. It came out of the Death Star, and you couldn't tell how it was powered because it was so advanced that it could be a deadly foe for anybody. So once it emerged into battle, everybody else on the human side was going to be in deep doo-doo.
How did you get in and out of it?
That's the question that was never answered. And that was written in the script and so forth, that this is never answered. You never know how whoever's in and is a deadly fighter got in, left, nobody came and kissed him goodbye. It was going to remain a mystery, and throughout all future Star Wars movies, if there were any, that was going to be the case.
So the next story is how the Death Star got its trench.
Yes. The Death Star was as big as a large satellite, but smaller than a planet. I described it on the surface of styrene hemispheres. And when the hemisphere came back, it was quite some time in manufacture, it was a problem because the two halves of styrene, which it took to be able to glue various nernies all over it, the two halves had, as is the nature of styrene, as it cooled, it had shrunk along the seam where it came together. So I called George and said, "Hey George, how about that there's a trench all the way around the equator of the Death Star, and that for the big shoot-'em-up finale, how about all the good guys and the fighters, which were under fire, have to go into a hazardous canyon that's all the way around there, and it looks like the tween decks of a well-armored aircraft carrier. And then for the finale of that, if the good guys can, in their last valiant efforts, pop the MacGuffin down the hole, then the battle will be won. And George said, "I'll call you back." Within a short time, he called me back, and that's how the trench got its, how the Death Star got its trench.
So, Colin has been working on this book for about 20-some years that I know of, and finally finished it in 2016. And Colin, why don't you tell us a little bit about CoreFires?
Okay. CoreFires were on the assumption that this was far in the future, and space travel had migrated and spread through the human galaxy, and that the things have become so routine that, and so technical, that a technical civilization had replicated itself through all the planets that were suitable for space travel in what was once the human galaxy. So the only place left for crazy adventurers was in the CoreFire, the core nebula at the center of humankind's galaxy. And that meant that only the hardiest of adventurers could man the ships that had to fly and deliver and exit from that rather frontier kind of existence. And they had to fly the freighters and their supply ships through tunnels of safe travel. But if they varied it all and encountered the CoreFire, then they were instantly toast. Very fine-grained toast. Yeah, how should I carry that?
Yeah, we need to move on to Q&A. That was a good start. Most of you should have the book already, so don't get too upset when you read the ending. You shouldn't have told us we were at Starbucks. You're fine.
The ending, as some of you have already determined, this is book 1 of book 2. And the reasons for that were that the technology for producing book 2 is what is going to take care of how the filming of book 1 is finished, and the bad problems are already solved to match the story that is already written. Okay.
All right.
So, testing. Do we have any questions for Colin? He'll also be out afterwards, sitting at a table out there if you want to ask a question. So, yeah.
Thank you, Colin. I was just wondering what your involvement with the production of the original Star Wars was. Was it that you came up with the original concepts and then left kind of the project at that point, or did you carry through into pre-production for A New Hope?
Okay, I did. I obviously built already the ships that are going to be used and so forth. And George was graciously cooperative as far as the story went. But for the eventual fine scale production, they had said that I would be excused, and the production team that had helped me with the testing of the models and so forth then would take over the actual production of the scenes for the rest of the film.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I was just curious if, while you were writing CoreFires, you built any of like the ships, models, or anything while you were writing, or if that influenced like the story or anything like that?
No, it didn't. Surprisingly, the action and the story implies a lot of technology, and it's well described. You'll find the novel is extremely descriptive from the few characters that are the key characters. What they're experiencing is highly descriptive, and you experience it. I modeled it somewhat on the ancient sailing days and the kind of daring that was routine and needed and surprising, and yet there's an overall hidden factor in the people that are inside the CoreFire and interact with the degradation that evil is propagating into the CoreFire civilization, such as it was, and its hardships. And there's a very spiritual aspect to that as well, with a keeper of that civilization.
Cool. Anything else?
How many models for each ship did you make, and do you still have them or any of them?
I did for a long time have them. The trouble is that I did lots of projects, and our house was 2 stories high, and the cellar was cityfied. They needed to update the architecture of that, so I had to have a sudden sale. And
We didn't actually have the models of the Death Star and the spaceships from Star Wars. We had the pre-production early pictures that we showed you, these guys, in the house, the originals.
And from the various projects, an auction was held, and that was spread things from my different projects throughout the industry.
Is there another question? I have too many questions, but I was wondering on the lunar landing slide, there was a quote there that said, "You'll never work again." And I was wondering what that was about. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I can explain it. Well, when he was working with Walter Cronkite on the first moon landing, he was, on the HAL 9000 computer, and Walter was broadcasting live on television what Colin was telling him to say, basically, about how the landing was proceeding. And so when Colin discovered that the landing wasn't, going along as it was supposed to, according to the actual manual, the other stations hadn't landed, and Colin didn't. And that's when the manager of the station was yelling in his ear, "You'll never work again." And then finally, when Colin was proven correct and everybody else was wrong, because he was listening to the words "locate" and all these different things happening as they were coming along, and then he was right and everybody else was wrong, and the station manager said, "We won, we won."
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, sure.
It's a really random. You're gonna laugh at me for asking this. I was wondering if you saw The Force Awakens and what you thought of it.
Is that one of the two current ones?
Yeah.
I was taken to the showings of those two here and very much enjoyed the fact that they had come around and echoed, instead of the various Star Wars that I didn't want to work on, it got back to redoing some of the simple stuff and its sense of adventure and commitment, guesswork, and the delight of unpredictability and making fun surprises, things that the plot didn't disclose until later. I was quite pleased that they had gotten around to doing that level and got to sit through both of those two that have been released, and was so non-disappointed and very pleased with the way that we had done it.
You mentioned that the original design for the Millennium Falcon was a lizard, but then it ends up being a disc after you have to reimagine it. So what was the sort of inspiration for the final design?
The final design was taken by the calendar. They needed to know what the heck they were going to do, and the amount of work, a bold clutch of designers took what parts of the Millennium Falcon and took them apart and separated them, and then figured which of these can we glue to which part of the other one. And, well, what do we do with this one? And they became very creative, and it worked. Yeah.
You said they had to change the design for the Millennium Falcon because there was another movie that had a lizard-shaped spaceship. What was the other movie?
I don't remember the name of it, and it wasn't very popular.
last question? Anybody? No? Oh, one more from Kevin.
Did you find that you were having to sell yourself to get all of these projects, or were you building a reputation from the early days where you were being sought out for your variety of expertise to work on these projects?
I had something that I did when I got to a new project possibility, and the first thing was for them to explain their project. And well, now how do you solve the first problem here and the problem over here? And okay, and then what do you do for this problem and that problem? And then there's the schedule. Let's see, if this, I always kept how many months on my scratch pad. The different experts contributing their different parts, and usually that involved some real showstoppers that others had to pitch in on. And they did. And what I did was then at the end say, what's the date that you need the ending by? What date does this project have to stop? Okay? How long does this stage have to be done before? And then back that up, and at the end of the meeting, I came up with my total of how many of those we had come, and what does that make the start date? And in every project that I worked in that way, the start date was 6 months before the meeting.
All right, so Colin, thanks so much for coming. Thanks for coming to see Colin and Sarah today. And he'll be outside if you want to get something signed or ask him other questions. They'll also have some other pictures out there that we weren't able to show here, but you might be interested in seeing as well. So thanks.
Thank you.